Welcome to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast, where we cut through the noise and help you make sense of the chaotic information space around us. I'm Griff Somke. In the first part of this two-part episode, I sit down with Seth Cotlar, who is a history professor at Willamette University and has documented and written extensively about the history of the far right in the Pacific Northwest. I've been a big fan of Seth's work for a few years now, and I'm really excited to have the chance to sit down and talk with him. Stick around.
This isn't the working class rising up. This is the ruling class punching down.
My game bigger than your game.
First rule of gladiator school, bro. Don't punch down.
Charging into goblins.
Hail Trump!
The threat from outside forces is far less sinister, dangerous, and grave than the threat from within.
Control your own body.
We will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country.
We can fight the entire grinding system. Nobody can. But together, everybody can.
I did nothing wrong.
Seth, welcome to Did Nothing Wrong. Hey, thank you for coming on with me today.
You bet. Happy to be here.
So you're a professor of history at Willamette University in Salem, Oregon, and you specialize in the history of the United States between the American Revolution and the Civil War. What drew you to this area of history and why?
It probably started with the bicentennial celebration in 1976 when I was 8 years old. And my grandparents bought me a book.
Okay.
There was all this celebration at the time of the founding era. And I was growing up in the middle of nowhere in central Pennsylvania. I didn't have any real authentic connection to any of that stuff.
So any entertainment at that point was good entertainment?
Yeah, I suppose. I don't know. I mean, and my family all immigrated in the late 19th and early 20th century, so I didn't have any, kind of biological connection to the 18th century. But I always just found it kind of vaguely intriguing. And then when I went to college, I became a history major and took a course in the American Revolution, and was just really fascinated by it, especially in terms of the history of that era and that movement, but also in terms of how it got remembered. And my sense is that this history was really complicated in terms of its contemporary implications and what we make of it.
Right.
But that it felt like it was kind of implicitly owned by a kind of Reaganite right.
Right. They've always sort of attached themselves to that era of history and said, no, this is us.
Right.
1776, that's our whole thing.
Right. And this was also the kind of heyday of the NRA's kind of rise to prominence and influence in the 80s, and and their appropriation of the Second Amendment and the militias and so on, which always struck me as kind of opportunistic and anachronistic.
Oh, very, yes.
But, this is the way historical memory works, right? I mean, we're always appropriating parts of the past in order to make sense of where we are in the present. So it's kind of an unavoidable feature of any political culture. But it just struck me as a really rich kind of moment when a whole bunch of really foundational questions about what does it mean to be a republic? What does it mean to be a democracy? How does representation work? What is justice? What is the role of the law? What is the role of the press in a free democratic society? All these huge questions that we've always been kind of wrestling with were kind of locked into place in the late 18th century in a way. And so it just kind of felt like the framework and foundation in which we have worked out all of our various disagreements with each other over time. And so I became especially interested in college and then graduate school in the more kind of democratic elements of that foundational moment, which weren't necessarily the dominant ones, but were very much kind of present at the time.
Right. The stuff that doesn't necessarily show up on page one of the text, but you start to look a little deeper and you realize, oh, they had this meeting, they had this publication that just absolutely was key to this whole thing.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you bring up the NRA because I grew up in Spokane, Washington, and we got one of the first like real modern, I think, test cases for the NRA to be able to show their political muscle. We had the Speaker of the House in the early 90s, a guy named Tom Foley, and he was an NRA life member. He used to go to the rifle range down not too far from where I lived and shoot all the time. He was great. The NRA loved him. But then he went and voted for the assault weapons ban. And the NRA decided in 1994 they were going to make an example out of him, and they came into Spokane and spent, $1 million on a house race, which was huge at the time. That was a ton of money in 1994,
Yeah.
and they managed to unseat the sitting Speaker of the House as a result. And that, I think, is the last time anybody seriously bucked the NRA on that side of the fence.
That's so interesting.
Made it very clear that, like, if you go against us, you're going to face a primary challenge, and if not that, you're going to face a general challenge, and we're going to make it hurt you.
That's so interesting. That, I mean, that sounds like a complete. I hadn't thought about this, but it's such a precursor to when Eric Cantor was defeated by the Tea Party. He wasn't the speaker,
He
but
was the upcoming young guy from that movement.
He was the upcoming Republican star, and some just complete rando named Dave Bratt.
I remember that. Dave Bratt,
Mark Levin, and all these. You got the Laura Ingraham, and got the whole Fox universe, and it was a real test case of how the kind of fringes. It's this dynamic, right, where the fringe says,
and they turfed him right out. They managed to turf him right out of that spot.
Yeah,
it is amazing what the NRA has been able to accomplish when they put their minds to something. It's you look back on that and you're like, wow, how different is history at that point if the NRA doesn't start in on this.
Yeah.
So you wrote a book about that era of history called Tom Paine's America, the rise and fall of transatlantic radicalism in the early republic.
Right.
It's about Tom Paine, who was one of the early propagandists and just kind of capsule sketch rabble rousers of the American Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
What got you interested in him, and what can we learn from his life and times that helps us with this like walking crisis that we're dealing with in the year 2025?
Yeah. So one of the most fascinating facts about Tom Paine, who wrote Common Sense, right? He's the guy who we associate with this popular movement in 1776 against the crown. So he's this guy who writes arguably one of the most widely read pamphlets of the American Revolution. When he dies in 1809, 6 people come to his funeral. 6.
6?
Yes, and he's widely reviled in American public. There's a tiny little group of people who still admire him. He leaves America in the late 1780s and spends most of the 1790s in France and in Britain. And he writes The Rights of Man, which is one of the kind of international bestsellers of the 1790s. It's like the Common Sense of the French Revolution, basically.
Okay.
And when he returns to the U.S. in 1802, he lands in Baltimore and he can't even get served a beer, like in a tavern. Like, he is so reviled. And and why is that, right? How does it come to be that the author of Common Sense becomes kind of persona non grata in this democratic nation? Even Thomas Jefferson, who is a Jeffersonian Democrat, who was a fan of Paine's, kind of keeps him at arm's length because it's kind of bad optics, right, for him to be associated. And so to me, this seemed like, well, that's weird. Like, how does this happen? How does Thomas Paine become this enemy?
Founding father, absolute voice of the revolution.
Right.
God, you don't have it if not for that guy. How did that happen?
So it's complicated, but part of it has to do with religion, because he wrote a book called The Age of Reason, which was sort of an attack on organized religion.
Okay.
And it's not an atheist track; it's a deist track. He says, "I believe in God," whatever.
Yeah, like a lot of these guys at the time.
Right, but it's basically like claiming that organized religion is basically a big grift that people use to wield power over others. So, he's kind of a foundational figure in the history of kind of free thinking in the U.S.
Right.
And kind of secularism, basically. So that's a part of it. But I think even more important is that he becomes associated with the French Revolution in the 1700s. And the French Revolution very much frames itself as a continuation of the American Revolution.
Right,
Um,
right,
and so in the US, American politics in the 1790s gets kind of polarized and inflected along these lines of, are you for or against the French Revolution? In fact, there was even the equivalent of a kind of MAGA hat in the 1790s, which was the black cockade that you would put in your hat in order to show that you were opposed to the French Revolution. Uh,
right.
and there were certain bars where if you walked in with the uh, blue cockade, which showed you supported the French Revolution, you would get beat up. Um, and so on.
Some
So
things never change.
some things never
Some things
change,
just
right?
never change.
And it was all bound up also with the kind of conspiracy theory of American politics, which is the Illuminati conspiracy.
Ah, yes,
Right.
yes.
So in 1798, the Federalists, who opposed the French Revolution, kind of became obsessed with this idea that somehow the French Revolution and the Americans who supported the French Revolution were part of an international anti-Christian conspiracy that was the Bavarian Illuminati, uh,
Right,
that sought to like infiltrate the churches and destroy the family, and so on, all the scare tactics. So this dynamic in the 1790s, where this kind of reactionary movement that sought to kind of associate the kind of aspirational democratic movements of the 1790s, to associate them with the destruction of everything you hold dear, right? Was a dynamic that had some sort of contemporary resonances when I was writing the book, but this was in the late 90s into the 2000s. So it's all
right,
even pre Tea Party. Um, um, but to me, it was an interesting moment where this nation founded in revolution, with all of these kind of proto-democratic elements to it, and populist kind of democratic elements to it, how that kind of gets put back in the bottle and sort of contained, those
right,
features of the revolution. And part of the way that it gets contained is through this backlash that happens in the 1790s, and Tom Paine becomes the kind of symbol of that or the object of that backlash, and he gets turned into a useful enemy, right?
right.
Uh,
So they went from revolutionary to reactionary in the space of about 10 years, it sounds like, and they managed to take one of the guys who was strongly associated with the revolution as one of the founding, writers of all of this, and turn him into a bad guy because how he felt about what was going on in France.
right.
Interesting. Huh.
Yeah. So that, and not to like line, Tom Paine doesn't have all the answers to all of our problems, right?
No,
It's not as if he's some like far-seeing hero who,
right, or lost,
what Tom Paine wanted, it would all be
source of
okay.
wisdom or whatever.
Right. But he is a kind of avatar, and he also becomes a symbol for a lot of the folks in the US who are advocating for a more kind of robustly democratic
Right.
political culture, and so on.
Okay. Okay. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that you focused on in your career is also the far right,
Mhm.
in specifically the far right in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah.
And I got to ask, how'd you get into that? What drew you to this field?
Okay. It's a long story, but I'll try to tell it very briefly.
Don't worry
So,
about it. We're not on the clock here, so go right ahead.
so in roughly around the Tea Party era, um, I started noticing a few of my students, and it's a liberal arts college, so it's
Right.
generally progressive students, started asking me about the Tea Party and about conservatism. And I was asked to talk about it because it's, invoking the memory of the American Revolution in a certain way. So I got interested in that, how people are deploying the memory of the revolution for contemporary political purposes. And one thing I noted from some of my students was that they seemed to come at the Tea Party from a perspective of, these American conservatives are different from me because they're either stupid or evil. And those were the two ways of kind of understanding it. And, I didn't want to say to them, well, you're wrong, but it just didn't feel sufficient, right? It didn't feel
Right,
useful.
right.
And I was still in this mode of thinking like American politics is about argument and agonistic sort of engagement. And so if you want to understand the people who you disagree with, or if you want to successfully oppose the people you disagree with, you have to understand them and where they're coming from,
Sure,
not
sure.
treat them as, evil or stupid. And so I decided to teach a course on the history of American conservatism. And part of
Okay.
the reason because of that also is that there was a huge wave of amazing books that were coming out. It was this real growth field in the history profession of people trying to understand the roots of contemporary conservatism. So there was a ton of great books that I could assign and read with my students. So that was the kind of start of getting interested in the American right. But the entry point was just trying to understand conservatism. And then as I started doing it on social media, I noticed that people were using all these fake quotes from the founders. Um,
No, I
my very
remember those.
first social media foray actually was a Tumblr back in like 2011 called Fake Founders Quotes. I think it still exists somewhere on the interwebs because I just started cataloging all these
Hmm.
moments, and it's like, and the irony was like, these are the people who call themselves originalists who supposedly love,
Yeah, no.
right, the wisdom of the founders, and they just circulate completely made up
Oh,
quotes
yeah.
from these guys who they supposedly admire for their wisdom. And it's like, wait a minute, like this is so obviously fake. What are you doing? Like, are you really an originalist? Maybe your originalism is not in good faith.
Maybe.
Which felt like a really kind of snarky, obnoxious thing to say in 2011, 12. Now it's just like, well, of course they didn't actually believe it. But back
And it's,
then, I
if
was still
anything,
in
gotten
this.
worse.
Right. Oh
They've
my God.
just,
Right.
yeah, I mean, one of my favorites, and I got to rage about this because this just drives me crazy. One of my absolute, just in a really terrible way, favorites is the to find out who rules over you, ask yourself who you are not allowed to criticize. That always gets attributed to Voltaire when
Right.
it's actually a guy named Alfred Strom, who's a former member of the National Alliance, hung out with William Luther Pierce, who wrote the Turner Diaries, got himself busted for child molestation at one point.
Yep.
This guy's like terrible, but they've been passing that off as a Voltaire quote for years.
Oh yeah.
And
Yeah. And so fun fact, he actually now currently lives in the same county where I grew up in central Pennsylvania, this tiny
oh,
little
how nice. I'm
county.
sure they're thrilled.
He's married to, so the Leo Frank trutherism has been in the discourse
Oh,
lately.
right.
And his
Okay.
wife, who is very young,
Sure.
cut her teeth writing a supposed expose about Leo Frank for the National Vanguard website.
Oh, great.
Yeah. So
The whole trifecta of just wonderful right there. You're married to Kevin Allen Strom. You're writing for Vanguard. You
right.
writing about Leo Frank. This is just, yeah,
It's
you're great.
it's awful.
Wonderful.
Well, and also that Kevin Strom quote was one of the first things that Elon Musk tweeted out after he purchased Twitter.
I
Was one
remember
of his
that. I
first
remember that now. Oh,
tweets,
God. Just,
which
we're
now
in
makes
for
a
it
whole lot
now.
of sense.
It's just,
Right.
and that's really interesting that, like, there's so much of that, and we'll get to that a little later, but I find it very fascinating that a lot of these guys are steadily quoting, they're quoting these anti-Semitic writers and priests and various other people that were very well known for this, but they're either quoting or making up quotes that are supposedly from these people
Right.
that are not exactly the way it was presented, and they'll never ever tell you how exactly these guys kind of got famous. I remember the first time I think I ever interacted with you online was when you had some screenshots of a guy named Jack Posobiec, who we've talked a lot about on this program, quoting the Catholic priest, Father Dennis Fahey. And he was quoting him specifically on the Christ is King thing that he had been pushing at the time. But he was really well known for his anti Semitism at the time and for working with guys like Father Charles Coughlin, the former radio host, who is also quite the anti-Semite. And I find sometimes I'm wondering if I'm being really hard on the guy, or if it's just that he's being very disingenuous, that he knows all of these obscure anti-Semites and he likes to quote them, but he never ever tells you exactly what they are really famous for, or what the common thread is. And it makes me wonder why a guy is that up on anti-Semites, but never seems to really condemn it
Right.
all that hard. What do you think's going on there? Just out of curiosity.
Oh man, I can't believe you're asking me to try to get inside Jack Posobiec's head.
It's a strange and terrible place, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, these folks are propagandists. I think they are true believers. I think he
Right.
really believes in what he's doing. I don't think he secretly is just like, a normie Reagan Republican who's cosplays as a fascist. But to him, it's all about justifying a really aggressive and implicitly violent. He's often very careful. He walks right up to the line and
Oh
saying,
yeah.
"Look, we're
Oh
going to
yeah.
have
He's
to
good
kill
at
these
that.
people. Hey, but look, I'm not advocating violence, right?" So,
There's an art to that.
what's
Just
that?
an art to absolutely being able to walk up and advocate for that and say, well, nope, sorry.
Right.
That's not what I
Look,
said at
I'm
all.
calling these people unhumans who want to destroy you, but I'm not
Exactly.
saying that you should respond with violence, right? Because they're the violent.
Francisco Franco did a lot of good for the church in Spain, and that's why we're talking about him, not because, he
Right.
eliminated hundreds of thousands of his enemies or anything like that.
Look, everybody makes mistakes, right? I mean,
Yeah.
there's some
Yeah.
unfortunate things that
And
happen.
Franco was a good man.
Yeah, but basically, he meant well. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, that dynamic. So it's these like really deeply grooved kind of rhetorical these stories that folks tell, right, about the left, and how sometimes you just need toughness sometimes to deal with the threat of these people who want
Of
to
course.
destroy you and everything
Of course.
you believe in. And usually conspiracy theories become an important piece of this, right? It becomes, it's not just that Tony Fauci was a scientist, and as in all science, sometimes when new things are emerging, you maybe don't know whether masks actually do work or don't work, or we're not sure whether the vaccine is going to give permanent immunity or whether it will just help.
Right.
But that's not that's not interesting. It has to be Tony Fauci somehow
Mm-hmm.
30 years ago went to graduate school, or 50 years ago went to graduate school because he wanted to eventually murder millions of people, and he finally
Exactly.
got his chance during COVID, right? Or George Soros very much wants to
It's all about
murder.
Soros.
Yes, and so
Absolutely.
right. So these conspiracy theories that rely on dehumanizing people and creating a sense of victimhood to the people who they're pitched to, is the kind of crap that like any responsible person operating in public life knows you don't do that, because it's just Radio Rwanda stuff, right? I mean, this
Oh,
is like
absolutely it is.
textbook.
You are looking to create those kinds of responses where you have your people ready to, do whatever needs to be done about these awful hippies and these awful leftists that have taken over.
Right.
And you can step back from that and say, well, I said I didn't endorse violence. I said I didn't endorse any of this. I don't endorse any of what they're doing, but somehow the violence just seems to come out.
Right. Yeah. So it's emotionally activating right wing fascistic propaganda that is but the people it's pitched at don't know the history. They don't know
Right.
who Gerald O.K. Smith is. They don't know what any of this stuff, right? They're not familiar with it.
No.
So so they don't know that it's just this kind of incredibly boring and repetitive crap that has been part of our political culture for decades.
Right.
Or the Illuminati stuff that goes back to 1798. It's just all these recycled kind of talking points and stories. But what it does is it creates this enormous reservoir of information that if you do your own research, you can discover all of these amazing books that they don't want you to read. They didn't tell you about the Bavarian Empire. But look, this is from 1798, man. Like they knew about this all the way back then. But they don't teach you this in school. They won't teach you that, right? And so anyway, it's just the dumbest shit imaginable. And it's completely predatory in terms of how people use it to take advantage of the real concerns and real problems that people face in their life, right?
Right.
It's the Conspirituality podcast guys have a great phrase for this, which is that it gets the feelings right but the facts wrong.
Oh, that's good.
That's
really good.
Feel like the system isn't working for them.
The
And
vibes.
in many ways, it's
they match
not.
the vibes, and then they get in there with their explanation as to why those vibes are there. And
it's George Soros, man. It's George Soros. That's why you can't afford your grocery bills. It's
absolutely because George Soros needs more money. And that's one of the things I think I like the most about your work is that you come in a lot of the time, especially on, Blue Sky now, probably Twitter a lot more back then. I don't know how much you're using it these days. I'm not using it very much myself at all.
Yeah.
You come in with the historical context for a lot of this stuff. Like you'll You'll have stuff that got said in the 1940s by a guy like Father Coughlin or Dennis Fahey, and you'll talk about what kind of advertisements the John Birch Society was putting in local papers in Oregon at the time. And if you look at this stuff, you can definitely see a common thread
Hmm.
between what was being said in 1940 and what's being said now. Like, fluoride is a great example of that. This is one of those things that they've always freaked out about having in the water. And you probably could not get enough votes to pass that today almost anywhere if you tried, just because of where the situation is.
Yeah.
Portland, Oregon does not do fluoride in the water to the best of my knowledge, and probably never will,
Yeah.
just based on how people seem to feel about it.
Hmm.
So I find myself thinking, wow, this is really great to be able to have that sort of thread all the way back. When you started researching that stuff, was that something that you kind of discovered looking back through all of that and realizing, hey, this is all sort of recycled narratives from, the 1940s and 1950s that we're just kind of being faced with again now?
Yeah, it's not what I expected. That wasn't even the question that I had going into it. I mean, I sort of stumbled into this study of the far right in 2021 or 2020 during COVID,
Okay.
because I decided to teach a course on the far right. So in the age of Trump, my history of conservatism class started merging into a history of the far right class, or trying to think about what's the relationship. It's because the literature on the history of conservatism almost never talked about the far right, and the history.
Right, because they made a concerted effort to get rid of all of those people. And,
Right.
they kicked out, the Sam Harrises and the guys who were very more blood and soil conservatives. The Buckley got rid of the Birchers supposedly, and those people were all persona non grata. They didn't get to talk anymore in respectable circles.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I mean, that's partially true and also partially not true. But part of what the literature was moving towards is a rethinking. It started from the presumption that, like, oh, there's the history of conservatism, and then there's the history of the far right, but those two things really don't. There's not
Right.
right.
Even though.
And now I think folks are seeing it much more as a kind of continuum, and
Right.
actually, so there's a great book by a guy named John Huntington called Far Right Vanguard, and that was really influential on my thinking, where he makes the argument that the far right has actually served as the kind of like beta testing place for a lot of messaging and issues that then find their way into conservatism. And so it's like a
Uh-huh.
vanguard, right? It's a creative vanguard. It's not just a bunch of wacko kooks just talking to themselves off in a corner that no one's paying attention to. It's actually kind of the future of where conservatism is moving. And so that argument I'm really compelled by and sort of convinced by. And so anyway, so in 2020, I decided, I'm going to teach a course on the history of the far right, which is something that I knew a little bit about, but it gave me an opportunity to read a whole new kind of literature and teach a
Right.
topic. And so I thought, I'm going to look for a hook that is an Oregon hook. I'm going to look for a local hook. And so I had this database, had access to this database, typed in Oregon, and found all of these materials from the 60s from a guy named Walter Huss in Portland. And I was like,
Okay.
Walter Huss, never heard of that guy before. And I asked one of my colleagues who's a specialist on Oregon history, and she's like, I never heard of him. I asked all my friends who did history of conservatism. They're like, Walter Huss, never heard of the guy. And then as I started doing research, I'm like, he became the chair of the Oregon Republican Party in 1978. And
So he wasn't exactly just some random kook. I mean, he was as respectable gets in that side of things.
Yeah, well, he I wouldn't call him ever respectable, but he was able to become the chair of the
But he
Oregon
managed to
Republican
get a
Party.
high position in the respectable conservative party at that point.
Yeah, or he had enough support in the party to become the chair in
Right.
1978 and 1979, and so I discovered that 57 boxes of his papers were at the University of Oregon. And I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. Like a huge cache of his archive was down at the University of Oregon, but I couldn't get access to it because it was COVID, so the library was closed.
Right, because they weren't, yeah.
So all I knew they were, and it wasn't super detailed in terms of the cataloging, but it was by box and by folder. And I noticed that in box 2, there were 2 folders labeled Jews. And I was like, that's probably bad. I was like,
Yeah, just kind of put it in context.
it's probably bad, but he's a minister, right? So he's a Foursquare minister. Maybe he has a theological interest in Judaism.
Maybe.
I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt, Um, and so all I could do was use newspapers.com and other databases to find, and there are thousands of newspaper articles written about him over the course of his career. So I basically did all of that research. And in none of that research, people would be like, "Oh, he's a pretty conservative guy, or he's maybe a little bigoted." So some of it was like suggested that there might be something like kind of icky. And then finally, when I got access in August of 2021, I think it was, drove down to Eugene, requested the Jews folders, opened them up, and it was just like neo-Nazi central. It was just
Banger
like
after
greatest
banger
hits
after
of anti,
banger.
straight up Nazi shit. And I was like, wow,
Of
okay,
course.
this is a story, right? Like this is a
Right.
story. And in part, it's a story because the Oregon Republican Party was known for its moderation. So like the senators at the time were Mark Hatfield, who had
Right.
opposed the Vietnam War, who was a very aggressive advocate of civil rights, who was pro-environmental regulation. And was
Yeah,
a
he was
Republican.
good.
Yeah,
He was good on pretty much everything.
right. And then Bob Packwood was the other, whose career ended ignominiously because he was a sexual assaulting
A little bit handsy
monster.
there.
But in this, before that all came out, what his reputation was for being a moderate Republican, and he was pro-choice
Right.
and was moderate. He was a kind of Rockefeller type Republican. So how does this neo-Nazi become the chair of the Oregon Republican Party, known for its moderation? So anyway, so that question has basically now been what I've been pursuing for the last 4 years or so, trying to figure that out.
It's interesting that you bring that up, that, Oregon, Washington to some extent too, Oregon as well, has always had this reputation, at least in modern times, for being this incredibly progressive area. Like, to hear Fox News tell it, we're both kind of Antifa town and that they run everything around here. But there have always been guys like this that have had these kinds of views, and they've migrated to places like Seattle and Oregon, and kind of let the freak flag fly to some extent.
Right.
And what do you think there is about these places that has been such a magnet for this end of the far right and the Nazi movement?
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a really kind of deep history in terms of going back to the 19th century, right? And the kind of racist history of the founding of states like Oregon,
Right.
Washington.
There was something in the Oregon State Charter about not like entirely endorsing the free movement of Black people. Wasn't there something to that effect?
Right. The black exclusion laws. Yeah. I mean,
Right.
it was basically illegal to be black in Oregon in the 1850s. Right. And so, which was not uncommon. I mean, there were other states, right, that had similar laws.
Sure.
Right? And we tend to forget this, but, a good number of white abolitionists in the 1850s hated slavery most. And then probably the second thing they hated after that was living around Black people. So it wasn't necessarily the case
Right.
that if one was a white
They weren't
abolitionist,
necessarily progressive. In some cases, they just wanted to get rid of them altogether.
right. So the white abolitionism produced people like John Brown who were anti-racist.
Right.
But also white abolitionism was very congruent with a kind of a vision of colonization, right? Where America would be a white country and Black people would be freed from slavery, but then sent to their own country, right? Because
Right.
America was a white country as they saw it.
Sure.
So that
Ship 'em
vision
back.
of America as a multiracial democracy that is shared equally by white and Black people was very much a kind of hard won and maybe not permanently won kind of struggle that happens from the 19th into the 20th and 21st century.
Right.
So anyway, so Oregon was a product of that, and there was a wide range of opinions about sort of white nationalism or white supremacy in Oregon. There were also like anti-racist abolitionists in Oregon as well, right? But then, because of those, the overwhelming whiteness of Oregon's population,
Right.
until World War II, basically, when a lot of Black workers came to work in the
The
shipyard.
war industry and the shipyards and the shipping,
Right.
defense contracting. Yeah.
Right. And so that then fueled. So like the guy I'm writing about, Walter Huss, was born in 1918, and in the late 30s, he worked in the shipyards. And the fascists of the 1930s, the Silver Shirts and the Bund, recruited in the shipyards. right? Because they were tapping into the resentments that white working class men in Portland had at this influx of Black workers who I don't want to paint the New Deal and the FDR administration in too rosy a light, but often, the word from the sort of federal government was you can't discriminate against Black workers, right? Like
Yeah.
if a Black worker gets promoted and they are supervising a white worker, like get over yourself, right?
Right.
Like, that's the way that works. And these white workers from Portland, many of them were like, oh my God, this is communism. This is terrible. What's happening? I have a Black boss? That can't
Yeah.
be. That's not right. And so these fascist organizations kind of identified that resentment, and activated it to get people activated against both the New Deal and the Democrats, and also against unions.
Right.
And so there was a real anti-union sort of right-wing fascist movement as well in the 30s, 40s that was allied with the police department. So like the head of the Portland Red Squad that was identifying and rooting out communists was also buddy with the Silver Shirts and these other fascist organizations in Portland in the 1930s and 40s. So that's the milieu that produces someone like Walter Huss, right, who identifies the New Deal, Democrats, unions, and the federal government with a kind of existential assault on his sense of ownership over Portland and Oregon as a place. And so that becomes the kind of driving, kind of animating force in his political life, is making Oregon great again, if you will, right? Restoring it to his vision of when it was a white Christian society. I mean, the irony in all of this, of course, is that his parents are both immigrants.
Of course.
Yes. And he becomes a virulent opponent of immigration in the 1970s and 80s, and so on.
And then you have the era of the skinhead era. I think of it kind of in the 1980s, the white nationalism kind of 1.0,
right,
that people like to refer to, where you've got your guys like Tom Metzger, who ran the White Aryan Resistance, who were also finding, fertile ground for their messaging in places like Oregon, places like Spokane, Washington. They would come up and they would do these meetings. And in Oregon specifically, there was an incident where Tom Metzger's son, John Metzger, who was also very in with this group, came up and spoke to a group of Nazi skinheads who called themselves East Side White Pride. A couple of them went out almost immediately afterwards and ended up beating an Ethiopian immigrant named Mulgetu Sarah to death with baseball bats. And it became this case where somebody decided to try and sue Tom Metzger and his organization as a result of this. And Metzger ended up losing a massive legal judgment after a long trial. And, the guy's family ended up getting compensated for it, but it was still a case of, this guy comes over to the United States from Ethiopia. He's going to school. He's trying to be, I think he was a cab driver at the time when all this went down. And he ends up getting beat to death by these Nazi skinheads. And I think that's one of those things that made people sort of sit up and say, wait a minute, this isn't some progressive utopia. We've got incredibly violent, feral packs of young guys that are out here, beating immigrants to death with bats.
Right.
And it sort of made everybody, we had a similar incident in Spokane at the time, where a couple of skinheads ended up going to jail for, almost killing a guy at a Safeway downtown, similar reasons. And they finally started kind of taking a look, I think, at groups like Metzger's and how much they were influencing places and groups like this in Portland. And I think that's where people started to wake up a little bit to the idea that maybe this isn't all just, hippies and radical politics up here. There's several strains of radical politics, and this isn't necessarily the one that you were thinking it was.
Yeah. No, for sure. There's a great book about this whole episode called 100 Little Hitlers by Eleanor Langer, who was a journalist who did, and there's also a really good podcast series that KBOO in Portland did called It Did Happen Here. That reconstructs that history of Mulgetu Sarah and his murder and East Side White Pride. And interestingly, so the history of anti-fascism in Portland actually begins in the late 80s with that murder. So there's
Right.
a group called the Coalition for Human Dignity that was a coalition of kind of like anti-racist punk kids and
Hmm.
like liberal ministers and Jewish activists and some old school communist activists in Portland who,
Yeah, it was almost a true popular front in a way where you have as many people that oppose this stuff, regardless of ideological bent,
yeah,
that could agree that, hey, maybe we can solve the rest of these problems after we get some of these guys out of here, get
right.
them dealt with.
And so one of the things that they came to realize about what was happening in the late 80s and 90s is that there were all these movements happening on kind of parallel tracks, right?
Hmm.
There was the East Side White Pride, just avowed neo-Nazi guys. But then the guy I'm writing about, Walter Huss, was starting a movement at exactly the same time to take MLK's name off of MLK Boulevard.
Of
Which he claimed had nothing to do with race, right? It was
course
just
it
about
didn't.
city council and procedure. But everybody knew, or not everybody, but a lot of people understood what was going on there, right?
Hmm.
So Walter Huss,
Hmm.
who's this Christian minister, right, he has petitions on the counter of every business in Portland asking people to sign a petition to put the name of MLK Boulevard up for a vote in 1989 and 1990. Right. So as this Mulugeta Sarah sort of he's murdered in 88 and then the fallout from that happens after that. So this, and Walter Huss lived 8 blocks from where Mulugeta Sarah was murdered and in the same neighborhood as Eastside White Pride.
Oh,
I
wow.
don't think he ever had any interaction with them. Like they were simpatico in all these ways, but I think the Eastside White Pride guys probably thought Walter Huss was an old Christian fuddy-duddy.
Right.
He probably
Right. And he
thought,
probably thought they were ruining the optics of everything he wanted to do.
yeah, or that they dressed wrong, they
Hmm.
weren't like good, so I don't think there was any conscious interaction, but they were very much in simpatico in terms of their ideas about LGBTQ folks, about people of color, etc.
Oh, yeah.
And also at the same time was the Oregon Citizens Alliance, which was this anti-gay,
Right.
anti-LGBTQ movement, which Huss was connected to, but wasn't in a leadership position. But they were very much picking up on all of the kind of right-wing populist culture war stuff that Huss had been talking about since the
Right.
60s.
And that was Lon Mabon with the
Exactly.
Oregon Citizens Alliance. And they had the, I believe it was Initiative 9, I
Yes.
think it was called,
Measure
that
nine.
was the
Mhm.
basically almost making it illegal to be gay
Yes.
in Oregon.
Right.
And this was not some distant past type of thing. This was 89, 90, 91. This stuff was going on.
Exactly.
People were still, doing benefit punk rock shows up here for people who were opposing the OCA
Right.
because everybody could see that this was just this absolutely existential threat. And if they get something like that on the ballot, it's not a real long leap to they're going to be coming for you for
Right.
real.
Right. Yeah. And so this is where the Coalition for Human Dignity formed to try to bring the city's awareness to the
Right.
nature of the threat. Because one of the arguments in 100 Little Hitlers by Eleanor Langer is that, ironically, by turning the murder of Mulugeta Sarah into a national issue about Tom Metzger and neo-Nazis, it enabled the leadership of Portland to turn that event into an anomaly. Well,
Right.
we had this tiny little group of extremists who were deluded by Tom Metzger, and then they
It's
did
all
this
his fault.
terrible thing. But this is not who we are as Oregon, as a city of Portland, right? So they would condemn it. Obviously, this is a terrible act of violence, but it's not indicative of anything broader, right, about Oregon or Portland. And so that messaging that was very opportunistically glommed onto by the leadership of Oregon and Portland.
Right.
Eleanor Langer was like, hang on a second, this is so the OCA people did not celebrate the murder of Mulugeta Sarah. They would never associate themselves with
No,
the South White
absolutely.
Pride.
Those people were vile racists. We're good Bible believing Christians here.
Right. But
There's a
on the
real
other
difference.
hand, in 1993, OCA held a fundraiser where Marilyn Shannon, who was a sitting state legislator at the time, opened the event by asking everyone to pray for Shelley Shannon, who had just tried to murder George Tiller and failed.
Right.
And eventually George Tiller would be murdered by an
Yes.
So Shelley Shannon was a member of the Army of God that was an explicitly domestic terrorist organization that sought to murder abortion providers. And so Marilyn Shannon, sitting state legislator, opens an event by asking people to pray for a murderer, for someone who had tried to murder an abortion doctor. And sitting right next to Marilyn Shannon when she said that was John McCain. And
How
it's a
maverick.
long story why John McCain was there, because he did not really like these people. He was not of them, but he was there because in 1992, likely this is the case, Bob Packwood,
Okay.
who had been primaried and almost lost in 1986 to a right-winger, made a deal with the Oregon Citizens Alliance that they wouldn't primary him if he brought in a heavy hitter to help them raise money. And that was John McCain. So John McCain was there because the Republican Party in Oregon was trying to hold on to that seat by not having Bob Packwood be primaried from the right.
Right.
And that was
Probably
basically
decided
the
to help
end.
out his friend Bob Packwood here, and next thing you know,
Next thing you
jeez.
know. Yes. Anyway,
Probably asking himself, what was he doing here?